Okay then, the Minnesota Timberwolves are acquiring Rudy Gobert in exchange for Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley, Walker Kessler, Jared Vanderbilt, and 4 first-round picks. Those picks being 2023, 2025, and 2027 unprotected Minnesota picks, and a top 5 protected pick in 2029. So, goodness gracious, I'll make it clear right off the bat. I didn't think Rudy Gobert had anywhere close to that amount of value. What that tells me is Utah didn't see value in the other players they were getting in exchange in this deal, and the only thing they saw value in was these picks. Let's talk about the overview first, and then we'll get into the grade. So the overview here for Utah is clearly they're going into a different phase. Whether this means a Donovan Mitchell trade is coming or not, I'm not sure, but it's clear that they either want to try a different configuration around Donovan Mitchell that does not include Rudy Gobert, which we had kind of anticipated, or they're going to be on their way to a full and complete rebuild that's going to include trading Donovan Mitchell, trading Mike Conley, trading Bogdanovich, and completely tearing down the roster. And this is a pretty good start to doing that in terms of compensation. Meanwhile, for Minnesota, their concept here is they have offense. They have D'Lo, they have Ant, they have Cat. They need a way to raise their ceiling defensively. That was the concept for a couple of different teams that could have possibly traded for Rudy Gobert, including a team like Atlanta, where you know how to score and you need a solution to your defensive issues. And for Minnesota, clearly they believe that Rudy Gobert is that guy. Let's just begin here with the Minnesota side of this. In pretty much any scenario, giving up 4 first-round picks and a guy that you just drafted, Walker Kessler, in exchange for a 5 that makes as much money as Rudy Gobert does over the next couple of seasons, that is not a significant offensive threat, is an L. There's just no way you can convince me that is a worthwhile trade. 2 first-round picks? Sure, maybe. But, the only way that this makes sense to me is if Rudy Gobert was making $10 million a year for the next 5 seasons. The money that he's making over the next couple of years automatically to me meant that he was only slightly a trade asset. And some people could argue that he was basically a neutral player given his contract, even with how good he is defensively. And I understand the benefits of pairing Karl-Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert, which we're going to talk about. But even irrelevant of the players you traded in this deal, I still kind of like Malik Beasley. They did sign Kyle Anderson to, add a wing to this rotation, so they're not just, completely without wings next year. And then obviously Jared Vanderbilt's a player that I like as well. But even if there weren't any players involved, even if you could magically just take on Rudy Gobert's $45 million salary and trade 4 first-round picks, I wouldn't do it. When I was imagining Rudy Gobert trades going into this offseason, I was thinking maybe 2 firsts, maybe, but that might have been pushing it. More likely 1 first and a decent young player. I didn't think that his value was anywhere close to this. Now, clearly I've misjudged that because I can't imagine Minnesota would have been willing to give up this many draft picks if they were betting, if they were, kind of going against themselves, offering against themselves. Clearly there were other teams out there interested in Gobert, and clearly his value was much higher than I had anticipated that it would be. But from a grade standpoint, this to me is a D for Minnesota. It's just not a good idea. There might be immediate, basketball things that are good here. Gobert and Cat might be awesome next year, and your defense might go up a level. And maybe you're a top 5 team in the conference. Sure, maybe. Ant continues to improve. Maybe there's a D'Lo trade out there for you, whatever. But it just... Rudy Gobert is almost a negative contract. He's right to me on the borderline of a player that is a negative trade asset because of how much money he's going to make over the next couple of seasons. And Minnesota just traded for basically 5 first-round picks in exchange for that guy. You can't convince me that's a good idea. If you want to look at it optimistically, the reason it's not an F is this front court's going to be really fun. Gobert, defense is not the thing that prevents him from being a playoff player. We talked about that in previous videos. It's offense. It's the fact that he can't punish other teams for going small, and you're not going to be able to go small against this Minnesota team. If you try and play small against them, Cat and Rudy Gobert are going to destroy you on the offensive glass or off Cat post-ups, whatever the case may be. It's not going to go well for you. And so the main issue with having Gobert, the fact that he can't punish smaller lineups, is a little bit remedied in this situation in Minnesota. And if you put D'Lo and Kyle Anderson, Cat and Gobert out there, that's a very, very good basketball team. So in an immediate basketball sense, they're a better team today. Gobert is better than any of the guys they gave up, even as much as I like Jared Vanderbilt, even though I do like Malik Beasley a little bit. you're immediately better as a basketball team. But in the long term, when you're not a championship contending team and you're giving up this much in terms of compensation, in terms of draft picks, it's just not worth it. And I guess this is just the era that we are in now. When we go back and look at the Drew Holiday trade, the James Harden trade, the Paul George trade, 4 first-round picks is now the new norm. Like, it used to be 1 or 2, now it's 4. Like, when you start a conversation with a player that is an all-NBA or an all-star caliber guy, regardless of their contract, you begin the conversation with like three firsts and a swap, and then you go up to 4, and in this case, basically 5 if you count the guy that they just drafted as well. This blew my mind. Like, the first notification came through, and it was like, they traded for Gobert, and I'm thinking maybe this is a D'Lo thing, depending on what Utah wants to do. Then it came through that it was multiple first-round picks and all these players. Okay, it's probably 2 firsts. Like, that's probably fine. No part of my mind ever thought that in this deal, in any deal for Rudy Gobert this offseason, 4 first-round picks were going to be involved. This is a D trade. It's an awful trade, in my opinion. One of the worst trades, certainly of the offseason, probably the worst trade of the offseason, and one of the worst over the last couple of seasons. I cannot believe the amount of compensation Utah got. And so on the other hand, of course, to me, this is a fantastic, boggles my mind that Utah was able to get this much in exchange for Rudy Gobert. I'm going to give them an A just because I don't know what else this leads to. Like, it's hard to give it an A+ when I don't know kind of what the rest of the plan is. But I think there's a lot of parallels to this. Like, you can compare this to, obviously the draft compensation is wildly different, but structurally, like, to me, it feels a little bit like Washington trading away Russell Westbrook to the Lakers, where like you're trading a guy that in theory is significantly better than any of the players you're getting back, Beasley, Vanderbilt, Walker Kessler, whatever. But the sum of those pieces and the ability for those guys to kind of round out your depth might be way more helpful than whatever Rudy Gobert was going to be able to provide you. And you find a budget 5 and you've got a wing in Malik Beasley that hopefully can guard and shoot, something they desperately need on this roster. Jared Vanderbilt is a super interesting fit with them. And you've got all of these picks as well. So even though this to a lot of people might seem like a situation where a Donovan Mitchell trade is incoming, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, if that's not the case, you now have a ton of what could potentially be very valuable picks to go out and get a guy that maybe fits better with Donovan Mitchell if that's something that you want to pursue. And they might have overnight just completely changed the direction of their franchise and their ability to improve this roster because they were able to get this many picks out of Gobert. Now, the counter to that would be this might just be a full rebuild. This might just be a situation where... Look, if Rudy Gobert is getting 4 first-round picks, you're getting at least 4 for Donovan Mitchell. That's just where we're at right now. And so maybe we're going to see a situation where Mitchell ends up with the Knicks and they get all those picks that the Knicks got on draft night in addition to a ton of other stuff. And all of a sudden, Utah overnight is turned into the Oklahoma City Thunder. And maybe that's going to be the case for them. There's no way to really know, to kind of predict the future on that. But to me, honestly, my best guess would be that they're going to use these picks to build something around Donovan Mitchell until Donovan Mitchell says that he doesn't want to be there anymore. This is just an unbelievable era of the NBA that we are now in, where teams are so willing to give up all these draft picks in exchange for, no disrespect to Rudy Gobert, he's good, but this is top 5 player in the league compensation here, in exchange for a guy that has a questionable playoff history and plays the least valuable position in the entire league and has a really bad contract. I can't understand. If I was Minnesota and Utah called me, they're like, hey, do you want Rudy Gobert? Yeah, let's have a conversation. Okay, how about all these players and 4 first-round picks, 3 of which are unprotected? I'm hanging up the phone. No other words are coming out of my mouth. This one honestly left me speechless when the full notification came through. The only other thing I would say on this deal, if you're trying to look a little bit more positively on the situation for Minnesota, it is this team in the history of their franchise has had basically nothing good. They've had really good players, but from a team success standpoint, they haven't had much. And had they not made a move similar to this, I'm not advocating for this being the move, but the concept of a move like this, where you're cashing in on a ton of picks, the idea would be, let's be relevant. Let's push for a top 4 seed, because right now we're looking at a team that is going to be, top 6, top 5 at best. Let's try and be top 4. Let's try and be top 3. Let's get something positive going for this franchise. And even if we don't have draft picks until 2029, or at least not in every other year, And even if Rudy Gobert is making $50 million in 2 seasons, who cares? We want to be relevant. We want to pair him and Cat together. We want to go win some playoff series. We want to be a team that pushes for the conference finals. For the finals, we feel like we have a really special player here in Anthony Edwards. And if you can build a defensive structure around him that allows him to focus solely on being an offensive creator alongside Karl-Anthony Towns, that can be the engine of a top 3 team in the Western Conference. That has to be your mindset if you're willing to trade this many picks in exchange for Rudy Gobert. But if you're asking me if I would have done it, 0 times out of 100 would I have made this deal. Even honestly, if the deal was 2 first-round picks, I would have really questioned trading for Rudy Gobert, given his contract and given the draft compensation. It's almost unjustifiable giving up this much, in my opinion. And just to confirm, by the way, Woj tweeted out that their plan is, as of this moment, to retool this roster around Donovan Mitchell, armed with potentially trading Bogdanovich or Conley. They got a first for Royce O'Neal the other day. They've got like 6 first-round picks, including the guy that Minnesota just drafted they traded. They're going to have plenty of options to potentially make moves around Donovan Mitchell, and especially if Gobert is a guy that he wasn't really getting along with, which it seems like the intel on that is pretty strong. Donovan Mitchell's probably much happier to be a member of the Jazz today than he was yesterday with Gobert gone, with these assets out there, with players coming back that can be helpful, fit a little bit better around him, and the opportunity to bring in whoever. I don't know. I mean, I guess at this point, the picks that they got in exchange for Rudy Gobert are only worth like, DeJounte Murray or something. Like that's just kind of the realm of the NBA we now live in. I'm going to just throw one thing out there at the end of this video. In 2 or 3 years, 4 or 5 years, when we're seeing what all these picks become, New Orleans, Oklahoma City, Houston, in this case now Minnesota, or Utah, excuse me, this is probably the biggest roster building experiment the league has ever seen. This many first round picks exchanging hands and gambling on your team still being good in 2027 and 2029 as a result of one transaction and the other moves you've made leading up to it. And the potential for disaster on one hand and absolutely ridiculous super teams on the other with these first round picks available. And who knows, maybe this leads to a Kevin Durant trade to Utah. Maybe they're able to get, I couldn't even fathom who they would bring in with this amount of compensation, but I guess this is just where we're at now, even when you're talking about someone like Rudy Gobert.